She was 18 years old and sleeping behind a feed store when she heard two men laughing about a windmill nobody would buy. No family remained to claim her, and no roof waited anywhere she had a right to it. Just a canvas satchel with a spare dress folded inside, a tin cup tied to the strap with a length of butcher's twine, and whatever dry corner a town would tolerate. Her in for a night or two before moving her along. On that particular morning, crouched in the lee of a grain sack with frost still silvering the boards above her head, she heard the county clerk and a liveryman talking about the old Renner windmill out past Cutter's Creek, and about how the county meant to sell it at the courthouse steps for whatever it would fetch, because nobody in 3 counties would set foot past its gate after dark. Because there was nowhere else in the world she had any right to go, and because $4 was $4 less than she needed, and she had exactly that much sewn into the hem of her coat, she walked the 2 miles to the courthouse that same morning to hear the particulars for herself. But what nobody standing on those steps knew, not the clerk reading out the notice in his flat auctioneer's drone, not the 2 farmers who had come only to watch somebody else lose money, not even the girl herself. Standing at the back with her satchel over one shoulder and her chin up in the particular way of a person who has decided not to look like she needs anything, was that behind a locked door on the 4th floor of that windmill, sealed since the night old Abel Renner vanished 9 years before, sat a room that would change the fortunes of an entire village, and that this girl, and no one else, would be the one to open it, settle in and stay close. And before we go any further, let us know down in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Mercy Doyle was her name, and she had been born in a 2-room frame house on the low side of a river town called Ashwater, the only daughter of a wheelwright named Silas Doyle and a seamstress named Vera, who had come west from Ohio with nothing but a trunk of good needles and a stubborn streak Mercy inherited whole. For the first 10 years of her life she believed, without ever needing to say so, that the small warm world of that 2-room house was the shape the whole world took. Wagon wheels were her father's trade, building them and fixing the ones that came in broken, and he smelled always of hot iron and linseed oil. In the evenings he would sit her on the workbench and let her hand him the spokes one at a time, while he explained why a rim too tight would split come the first hard freeze, and a rim too loose would rattle itself to pieces on the first bad road. Her mother took in sewing from half the town and taught Mercy at the kitchen table by lamplight, letters, figures, and the particular way a hem should be turned so it would never fray, with a way of humming while she worked that made the whole house feel like it was breathing in time with her. Scarlet fever came through Ashwater in the winter of Mercy's 10th year, and it took her mother in 6 days and her father in 11. When it was over, Mercy was standing in the yard in a coat 2 sizes too small, watching the burial society men load 2 plain boxes onto a cart, and there was no one left in that house but her. Her mother's cousin took her in that same week, a woman named Prudence Kettle who ran a boarding house 40 miles south in a rail town called Holly's Junction, and who agreed to take the girl, in the particular clipped tone of a person doing a duty rather than a kindness. Prudence Kettle did not beat her and did not starve her, and in later years Mercy would be careful to say so plainly whenever the subject came up, because it was true, and because nobody had ever taught her to lie about a hard thing just to make it sound harder. She also did not love her, not in any way Mercy ever felt land on her. And for 8 years Mercy Doyle earned her keep scrubbing boarding house floors and hauling boarding house wash water and sleeping in a boarding house attic that was an icebox in January and an oven in July. Growing up capable and quiet, and very good at making herself small in rooms where she was not wanted. One soft place existed in those 8 years. Old Tobias Reyes, the boarding house's hired handyman, a stooped Mexican-born carpenter who had lost 2 fingers to table saw before Mercy was ever born, and who did not talk much, but let her stand at his elbow in the tool shed on Sunday afternoons, while he mended chairs and reset window sashes, and fixed the things Prudence Kettle broke by neglect. He taught her to read a plumb line and true a door frame, and drive a nail without splitting green. Would, and he taught her how a building talked to you if you were patient enough to listen to what its groans and settles were telling you. Once, when she was 15 and had just been slapped by a boarding house guest for spilling wash water on his boot, Tobias Reyes put a small brass folding rule into her hand and closed her fingers around it and said only, in his careful accented English, "A tool remembers who holds it kindly." Spring took him in her 17th year, quietly, in the tool shed, a chair leg half mended in the vise in front of him, and Prudence Kettle buried him in the pauper's row without ceremony and rented his shed to a peddler inside the week. Mercy Doyle stayed on at the boarding house another year after that, because a girl of 17 with no people and no money does not have the luxury of grief slowing her hands, and she kept the brass folding rule wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of her satchel the whole while, the one object in the world ever given to her on purpose rather than left behind by accident. Those 8 years taught her things a girl does not learn in a happier house, and she carried every one of those lessons the rest of her life, whether she wanted to or not. Reading a room full of strangers came first, the way her father had taught her to read the grain of a wheel spoke, watching which guest paid promptly, and which one would need reminding twice, which traveling drummer's smile meant good humor, and which one's meant trouble a girl ought to be nowhere near when the lamps went low. A single tallow candle, she learned, could last a week of evening mending if a person was careful with it, and a worn collar could show its good side twice before it was fit for nothing but rags, and underneath all of it sat the particular arithmetic of a life lived on another person's sufferance. That gratitude and resentment can occupy the very same room in a person's chest, without either one ever quite winning out over the other. Not a cruel woman, Prudence Kettle, and Mercy took some private care all her life afterward never to say otherwise, because it would have been a lie, and her mother had raised her to hate a lie the way some people hate a debt. Prudence Kettle fed her plainly and clothed her adequately and never once raised a hand to her, and on the rare quiet evening she would sometimes sit across the kitchen table from Mercy and ask, in her clipped dry way, whether the girl had eaten enough, whether her shoes still fit, whether the winter coat wanted mending before the cold set in proper. Something in those brief exchanges was not quite warmth, but was not nothing either. A kind of careful ledger-keeping of duty that Mercy came, over 8 long years, to recognize as the only love the woman had left in her to give after a hard life of her own, she never once spoke of. Tobias Reyes's tool shed, though, was the true schoolroom of her growing up, the one place in that whole cold house where a girl was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. He would set her to sanding a chair rail while he mortised a joint, and he would talk, unhurried, about the towns he had passed through building barns and mending wagons before a table saw took 2 fingers and most of his taste for wandering. A tool cared for honestly. He taught her, patiently and by example rather than by lecture, would return that honesty tenfold, and a person who learned to work with her hands need never again feel entirely at the mercy of a world that did not particularly want her. She was turned out on her 18th birthday. Prudence Kettle did not put it that way, of course. Careful people never do. She put it in the particular administrative tone the world reserves for young women who have outgrown their usefulness to a household, saying only that the boarding house could not carry a grown woman's board for free any longer, and that Mercy was welcome to stay on as a paid lodger if she found work in town. Mercy looked at the wages a laundry or a mill would pay a friendless girl in Holly's Junction, did the arithmetic her mother had taught her at that same kitchen table years before, and understood within the hour that there was no way to stay that did not mean being slowly ground down to nothing in a room she would never stop paying for. So she packed the satchel, her second dress, her one good shawl, the tin cup and the horn-handled spoon she had used every day of her life at Holly's Junction, the brass folding rule wrapped in its handkerchief, $4 in coin, the whole of a year's careful saving from odd mending jobs taken in on the sly, sewn into the hem of her coat where the stitching could be picked and pushed back closed with a thumbnail. West along the rail line. She walked out of Holly's Junction, because west was the direction the trains went that nobody ever seemed to come back complaining about. And because a person leaving with nothing has to walk towards something, even if the something is only a rumor of a bigger town 2 counties over. Barnes took her in when a farmer would allow it, and feed store Eves when he would not, and she ate what 4 careful dollars and a strong stomach could manage. On the 9th night of walking, she came into a river town called Cutter's Creek with the last of the light, and found the loose corner of a feed store loading dock where the wind did not reach. And it was there, huddled against a grain sack with her satchel for a pillow, that she overheard the clerk and the livery man talking about a windmill nobody would buy. Laughing, the livery man told it, in the easy, cruel way men laugh about things that frighten them a little. The county had tried to sell the old Renner windmill 3 separate times now, he said, and gotten no bid past $1. And even at $1, the last man to raise his hand had thought better of it and put his hand back down before the gavel fell, because everybody in 3 counties knew what had happened to Abel Renner in that mill, and nobody wanted to own a building where a man had walked in one evening and simply never walked back out. Come morning, the clerk said, the county aimed to try a 4th time on the courthouse steps, and if nobody bid so much as $1 this time, the county meant to just board the place up for good and let it fall down on its own schedule, because it cost more to keep condemning a building than the building was worth. Mercy Doyle lay very still in the cold behind that grain sack and listened, doing the arithmetic her mother had taught her, which was this: a windmill was a roof, and a roof, cursed or not, was worth $4 to a girl who had been sleeping under feed store eaves for 9 nights running. Come morning, she washed her face at the town pump and straightened her collar, and walked to the courthouse steps with her chin up in the way that told a crowd she needed nothing from them. She stood at the back while the clerk read out the notice in his flat drone, describing 1 windmill, 1 mill house attached, and 40 acres of played-out creek bottom, offered for whatever the county could get. And when he asked for an opening bid, the crowd did what it had done 3 times before: nothing at all. A silence full of men studying their own boots. $1, Mercy Doyle said from the back, before she had entirely decided to say it. Every head in that small crowd turned to find her, and she felt the weight of it land on her the way weight always lands on a girl who has just done something a crowd did not expect a girl to do. The clerk, who had clearly not expected any bid at all, let alone one from a stranger with a satchel over her shoulder, cleared his throat and asked would anyone raise it, and a heavy-set man near the front in a good wool coat said, in a bored voice Mercy would come to know a great deal better before the year was out. $2, and let the fool have her fun after that. Garrett Voss, she would learn within the hour, was his name, and he ran the only bank in Cutter's Creek, and he had bid $2 on a cursed windmill for the same reason a man tosses a coin at a beggar, to be seen being generous with something he did not want. $3, Mercy Doyle said. Not unkindly, Garrett Voss laughed, the way a man laughs at a child who has wandered into a game she does not understand the stakes of, and said, "4 then, and we'll call it done," clearly meaning to end the joke there and let the county have its $4 and be rid of the whole business. Standing at the back of that crowd with $3.80 left to her name, Mercy Doyle understood in a cold, clear instant that she had exactly $4 sewn into the hem of her coat and not 1 cent more, and that this was the only bid she would ever be able to make, and that if she did not make it now, she would spend that $4 on a room somewhere for a week, and then be exactly where she had started, homeless and counting. $4, she said, and this time her voice did not shake at all. Low and general, the crowd's laughter rolled through, the way a crowd laughs at something funnier to them than it is kind, and Garrett Voss spread his hands as if to say the field was hers and welcome to it. The clerk, plainly wanting the whole uncomfortable business finished, brought his gavel down and pronounced the Renner windmill, and its 40 acres sold to the young woman in the back for $4, cash in hand. Mercy Doyle walked forward through a crowd that parted for her, the way crowds part for something they are a little afraid might be. Counted $4 out of the hem of her coat onto the clerk's ledger table, one coin at a time, and signed her name to the deed with the same steady hand her mother had taught her to turn a hem. Just like that, at 18 years old, with 80 cents to her name and a satchel over her shoulder, Mercy Doyle owned a windmill that no one in 3 counties would go near after dark. Garrett Voss watched her sign the paper with an expression she could not entirely read, something between amusement and a flicker of something else, something that might almost have been calculation, and said, not unkindly, "You know what happened to Renner out there?" "I know what people say happened," Mercy Doyle said. "That'll do you as much good as knowing the truth," Garrett Voss said, and touched his hat and walked off toward the bank. Mercy Doyle stood alone on the courthouse steps holding a deed to a windmill she had never seen, in a county where every soul who passed her on the street that morning looked at her the way people look at someone who has just done something remarkable and unwise in the very same breath. Directions came from the clerk, given without quite meeting her eye, and she set out walking the 4 miles to Cutter's Creek's edge and the 2 more beyond it to the played-out bottomland where the Renner windmill stood. The road took her past the last scattered farmhouses and out onto flat creek-bottom country gone brown with autumn, the kind of ground once worth farming and farmed too hard for too long by men who did not know when to let a field rest. The windmill itself came up on the horizon a full hour before she reached it, a tall dark shape against a paling sky, its great sails hanging still and crooked, 3 of the 8 canvas and lath vanes torn loose entirely, and the rest gone gray and ragged with weather. Taller than any building she had ever lived in, it stood, a squared timber tower 4 stories high with a stone mill house built on at its base, the whole structure silvered with age and neglect, its door hanging on one hinge and its yard gone to burdock and thistle taller than her waist. Beyond it the creek that had once turned its wheel, for this was no ordinary wind-driven grist mill, but one built by a stubborn German millwright 40 years before to run either on wind or, when the wind failed, on a small mill race diverted from Cutter's Creek itself. A double system old Abel Renner's father had built, and old Abel Renner had kept working right up until the night he vanished, ran low and brown between cut banks, more mud than water this late in the year. Mercy Doyle stood at the edge of that thistle-choked yard for a long moment with her satchel over her shoulder, looking up at the tower the way a person looks at something enormous that now, against every reasonable expectation, belongs to them. She felt something she had not expected to feel standing in front of a building 3 counties called Cursed, a small, stubborn, unfamiliar warmth. Because whatever else this building was, it was a roof, and it was hers and no one not Prudence. Kettle, not any landlord in any town she might otherwise have wandered into, could turn her out of it come morning. She pushed the door open on its one hinge and went inside. Rusted grinding wheel gone still on its spindle, a scatter of grain sacks so old they had rotted into paper, a set of open wooden stairs climbing up the inside wall into darkness. That was the mill house at the base, one large empty room. Cobwebs hung so thick between the ceiling beams they had gone gray and furred with dust, and something small scattered away into the wall as she stepped inside, and the whole space smelled of old grain dust and standing. Damp and something else underneath it, faint and sour, that she could not name and did not like. Walking its edges first before trusting its middle was what a person raised by careful people does with an unfamiliar building, and she found, tacked to the inside of the door frame with a rusted nail, a torn scrap of paper in a shaky pencil hand that read only "Do not go above the 3rd floor" and nothing more. No name signed to it, no date, just those 7 words left by someone who had apparently felt strongly enough about the matter to nail up a warning, and not strongly enough to explain it. She climbed the stairs anyway, because a girl with 80 cents and a roof over her head for the first time in 9 nights does not have the luxury of being afraid of her own house. A narrow bed frame gone to rust, A cold iron stove, a table and 2 chairs furred thick with dust, and a shelf of tin dishware untouched in what looked like years filled the second floor, what had once been living quarters. Great wooden gears and a vertical shaft running up through the ceiling to the cap, where the sails turned, held the 3rd floor, still and silent, hung with the same thick gray cobweb that had greeted her at the door. At the top of the stairs to the 4th floor, the miller's room, she would learn later that this was called, the small private chamber old Abel Renner had kept for himself above the works and below the cap, she found a door. Good and oak, stouter than anything else in that decaying tower, it stood shut, and across it, nailed in 3 places with heavy iron spikes driven deep into the frame, 2 crossed boards lay weathered gray but unmistakably deliberate. The mark of someone who had not merely closed this door but gone to real trouble to make certain it stayed closed. Mercy Doyle stood in front of that door for a long minute in the fading afternoon light, coming through a cracked window at the stairhead. She thought of the scrap of paper nailed to the frame downstairs, and of the way every soul in Cutter's Creek had looked away from her that morning rather than meet her eye, and of Garrett Voss saying, "You know what happened to Renner out there," in that tone that was not quite a warning and not quite a threat. And she understood, in the particular clear way a person understands a thing they have decided not to examine too closely just yet, that whatever had happened to the man who once lived in this tower, it had happened somewhere on the other side of that boarded door. Not that first evening did she open it. Cold and hungry, having walked 6 miles that day on a stomach with nothing in it since morning, she reasoned that a boarded door which had waited 9 years could wait 1 night more. She swept out a corner of the 2nd floor room instead, built a small fire in the old iron stove from broken lath and dry thistle stalks, ate the last heel of bread from her satchel, and lay down on the bare rope bed frame wrapped in her one good shawl. The brass folding rule from Tobias Ray's tucked against her ribs the way a person keeps the one thing in the world that was ever given to her on purpose. She watched the firelight move on the ceiling beams and told herself, the way a person tells herself true things in the dark when there is no one else to hear them, that a roof was a roof, cursed or not, and that she had slept in worse places with far less reason to hope. Weeks followed of the slow, patient work of making a ruin livable, and if you have ever taken a broken thing and returned it by inches to usefulness, you will know the particular satisfaction that work carries with it, a satisfaction no gift of money has ever quite matched. Lumber she could not afford, so she used what the tower already had, prying loose boards from the abandoned Millrace sluice to patch the worst gaps in the 2nd floor walls, using what Tobias Ray's had taught her in that Sunday afternoon toolshed to true up the door on its one remaining hinge, so it would swing and latch again, cutting and drying thistle stalks by the armload for kindling. 3 times that first fortnight, she walked the 2 miles into Cutter's Creek to trade a morning's mending work. For her mother's needle had taught her a trade even Prudence Kettle's cold house had not managed to take from her, for a slab of salt pork, a sack of cornmeal, and once, a good sturdy axe head she fitted to a hickory haft cut from a fallen limb behind the mill house. Wary curiosity greeted her from the village, the particular kind of a place that does not know yet whether to be afraid of a thing or sorry for it. Children were told to stay away from the mill road. An old woman named Odessa Prout, who kept the dry goods counter, would not meet Mercy's eye across the counter for the first 2 weeks running, though she never once refused her custom or shorted her a measure. A kindness of the quiet kind, Mercy noted, the kind that does not announce itself. Deputy Clay Aldous finally stopped her on the road one afternoon, a young lawman, 29, 3 years in the badge, with a soft-spoken manner that did not match the size of his hands, and told her plainly what the town otherwise only whispered. Abel Renner, he said, had run that mill for 11 years after his father's death, alone, unmarried, a careful and by all accounts an honest man who ground grain fair and charged fair and kept his own counsel. 9 years back, On an evening in late October with a storm building in the west, he had climbed to that fourth-floor room as he did most every evening, and in the morning the mill house door had been standing open and the fire in the stove gone cold, and Abel Renner had simply not been anywhere in that tower or on those 40 acres. Not that day, not the next, not ever again, not so much as a boot print in the mud leading away. 2 weeks the search had lasted, Clay Aldous said. Dogs and riders both, out along the creek and across the flats in every direction a man on foot might have gone. Nothing had ever come of it. No body, no sign. Just an open door and a cold stove and a man who had been there Tuesday evening and was not there Wednesday morning, and a county that, lacking any better explanation, had let the story grow the way stories grow in a place with more empty evenings than answers, until 3 counties over people spoke of the Renner Windmill the way they spoke of things better left alone. "Somebody boarded up the fourth-floor room," Mercy said. "Before I ever got there. Who did that?" Something complicated crossed Clay Aldis's face, and he said only that the county sheriff at the time, a man long since retired to his daughter's place in Missouri, had ordered it done during the search, on the theory, never proven, that whatever had happened to Renner had happened in that room, and a room like that oughtn't be left standing open for curious fools to wander into. He said it the way a man says a thing he has repeated so many times he has stopped listening to whether it makes sense. And Mercy Doyle, standing on that dirt road with an axe over her shoulder, thought privately that a room a man disappeared from Asterisk was an odd room to seal shut 9 years later against people wandering into Asterisk it. She kept that thought to herself, though, because a girl new to a town does not get far arguing logic with its deputy on her second week in residence. Home she went that evening and stood at the bottom of the stairs to the 4th floor for a long while, looking up into the dark, and did not climb them. Not that night, and not for another month besides, because there was a mill house to make livable, and a garden patch to break for spring, and a leaking roof over the 2nd floor that would kill her worse than any ghost if she let it go unmended through the coming winter. A person raised the way Mercy Doyle had been raised does not spend her strength on a mystery when there is honest work in front of her that will not wait. The boarded door was always there, though at the top of those stairs, and some nights, lying on the rope bed with the fire gone to coals, she would hear the old timber tower creak and settle the way old towers do, wood contracting in the cold, joints easing under their own weight. She would think of Tobias Ray's telling her a building talks to you if you're patient enough to listen, and wonder, in the particular idle way, mind wonders about a thing it has decided not to think about directly, what a room could hold that was worth 3 iron spikes and 2 crossed boards to keep a curious world out of it. If this part of the story has settled in with you the way that quiet crept into Mercy Doyle's evenings, go ahead and drop a comment now telling us whether you'd have climbed those stairs on the first night or waited, the way she did, because we're only getting started, and what she found up there is not what any of us expected either. Hard that year, winter came on, the way it does on Open Creek bottom. Country, and Mercy Doyle spent it the way a person spends a winter alone in a half-ruined tower with almost nothing. Carefully, every log counted, every meal stretched, every hour of daylight put to some use before the cold and the dark closed back in. Clothes she mended for half of Cutter's Creek that season, walking the 2 miles in and back in weather that would have kept a wiser woman by her own stove, because a needle was the one tool in the world that had never once failed to earn her a meal. By the time the snow finally broke in March, she had $11 saved in a tin box under a loose floorboard in the mill house, more money than she had ever held at one time in her whole life, and calluses on her hands from splitting kindling that would never entirely soften again. Small kindnesses arrived too that winter, the sort that do not make it into any ledger, but that Mercy Doyle remembered plainly all her life afterward. A farmer's wife named Hattie Volker, whose husband's shirts Mercy had mended twice over without ever once being asked to explain why she lived alone at the cursed mill, left a basket of eggs on the mill house step one February morning without a word of explanation, and without ever once staying to be thanked for it. A boy of perhaps 10, the youngest of the Prout line, was caught by his mother creeping close enough to the mill fence to leave a carved wooden bird on the gatepost before running off. And when Odessa Prout scolded him for trespassing near a haunted place, Mercy Doyle only laughed and kept the bird on her own windowsill from that day forward. Odessa Prout, of all people, thawed first. Somewhere in that hard winter, watching this girl walk 2 miles each way through weather that kept grown men by their own fires, the old woman's wariness had curdled into something closer to respect, and by February she had taken to setting aside the torn or stained bolts of cloth nobody in town would pay full price for, and selling them to Mercy at half measure, saying only, gruffly, that a girl who worked that hard for that little oughtn't have to pay full freight for cloth with a flaw in it. Mercy, who had learned a long time ago not to argue with a kindness once it was offered, thanked her plainly and took the cloth. March brought the ground beginning to soften, and the creek running high with snowmelt for the first time since she'd arrived, and it was then that Garrett Voss came out to the mill. Alone, on a good horse, in the same wool coat he'd worn on the courthouse steps, he found Mercy Doyle in the mill house yard splitting kindling, and watched her work for a moment with that same unreadable expression before he said, without any particular preamble, that the bank held the note on a great deal of the creek-bottom land around her 40 acres, land that had gone half to seed under tenant farmers who couldn't make the payments, and that he was of a mind to buy her out mill tower. 40 acres and all for $200 cash, more money, he pointed out, not unkindly, than she was ever likely to see any other way in this life. A fortune, $200 by any honest measure, to a girl who had arrived in that yard with 80 cents to her name, and Mercy Doyle set down her axe and looked at Garrett Voss for a long moment before she asked him plainly why a bank that held notes on half the creek bottom wanted a played-out mill and 40 acres of thistle badly enough to offer 50 times what she'd paid for it. Something about consolidating the water rights on the creek for a planned irrigation scheme, Garrett Voss said, smoothly and reasonably and at some length, and Mercy Doyle, who had learned to read a man's hands the way her father had taught her to read a wheel's rim, noticed that his eyes went, just once, up past her shoulder toward the tower itself while he was talking about water rights that had nothing to do with a tower at all. "I'll think on it," she told him, which was the answer her mother had taught her to give a man pressing for a quick yes, and Garrett Voss touched his hat and rode off. Mercy Doyle stood in that yard a long while after he'd gone, turning the offer over the way she'd once turned a spoke in her father's workshop, looking for the flaw in the grain. She did not sell. Not that week and not the next, though the offer nagged at her more than she let on, because $200 was a life she could not otherwise picture reaching for another 10 years, and a windmill 3 counties called cursed was, on any coldly reasonable ledger, a poor thing to hold on to over a fortune. Something in the way Garrett Voss's eyes had gone up to that tower kept her from writing her name to his paper, though, and something in the way an entire county had gone quiet rather than explain to her plainly what had happened to Abel Renner kept nagging at her too. The two things twisting together in her mind until she could no longer entirely tell where her stubbornness ended and her suspicion began. The first truly warm evening of that spring found her climbing the stairs past the 2nd floor and past the 3rd, past the great steel gears of the milling works, with the creek running loud below the tower and the last light going gold through the cracked stairhead window, and she stood once more in front of the boarded door at the top. And this time she did not stop there. She had brought the good axe. 9 years of weather working in through the cracked stairhead window had rusted the spikes deep into the old oak frame, and it took her the better part of an hour, prying and working and prying again the patient way Tobias Reyes had taught her a green board should be worked rather than hurried, before the first crossbar came loose in her hands with a groan of old nails tearing free of old wood, and another 20 minutes before the second bar followed it. Then the door itself stood before her, whole and shut, and for the first time in 9 years unbarred. Hand flat on that old oak, she stood for a long moment, thinking, in no particular order, of Abel Renner climbing these same stairs on an ordinary Tuesday evening with a storm building in the west, of the scrap of paper nailed to the ground floor frame in a shaking pencil hand, of Garrett Voss's eyes going up to this tower while his mouth talked about water rights, and of her own mother teaching her at a kitchen table that the only way through a hard thing was straight through the middle of it. And she pushed the door open. Small, the room beyond it, no more than 12 feet across, built into the very cap of the tower with a single round window facing west toward the creek, had been once a careful man's private chamber. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a trunk, a small iron stove long gone cold and rusted. Every surface in it was thick with 9 years of undisturbed dust, gray and soft as ash, disturbed nowhere by so much as a mouse's track, because whatever door or window had once let vermin in had apparently been sealed as tightly as the entrance itself. On the writing desk, exactly where a careful man might have set it down mid-task and never returned to finish, lay an open ledger book, its pages gone brittle and yellow, and beside it a pen long dried in its holder, and beside that, half buried under 9 years of dust, a small leather satchel that had clearly once been locked, its clasp now hanging broken and open. A long minute passed before Mercy Doyle crossed the room, because a person raised the way she'd been raised does not rush toward a dead man's last unfinished evening without first understanding what she is walking into. The last of the daylight came thin and gold through that round west window, catching the dust she had stirred up prying the boards free, so that the whole small room seemed for a moment filled with a slow settling gold haze, and somewhere below her in the tower's dark belly, a board creaked with the ordinary settling of old timber in a cooling evening. She stood very still until satisfied it was only the building talking to her the way Tobias Rays had taught her buildings do, and nothing more than that. First she looked at the trunk, which stood against the far wall with its lid closed but not locked, and then at the narrow bed, made up neat and undisturbed as if its owner had simply meant to return to it that same night, the coverlet still tucked with the careful square corners of a solitary man's habit. Something in the sight of that made bed, waiting 9 patient years for a sleeper who would never come back to it, caught in Mercy Doyle's chest harder than she had expected any object in that dusty room to catch her. A row of pegs along the wall held her eye next, where a coat still hung, gray with dust, and a second peg beside it stood empty, as though whatever hat or second coat had once hung there had been taken down deliberately by someone who wanted the room to look, to a casual eye, undisturbed rather than abandoned mid-evening. At last she crossed to the desk and picked up the ledger, and her hands, she noted with some private pride, did not shake at all. Dated the same October evening Clay Aldous had named as the night Abel Renner vanished, the last entry, written in a small careful hand, read, in part, that the miller had that day taken delivery of a strongbox from a man he did not name, a man who had come up from the county seat by night and paid Renner a sum of money to hold the box in trust until such time as its rightful use could be determined. Renner, writing by lamplight with what reads, even 9 years later, like a careful man's growing unease, had noted that the box's owner asked him twice, pointedly, whether anyone else knew of the arrangement, and that Renner answered truthfully both times that no one did, and had written, in the very last line his pen ever set to paper, I do not like the manner of this transaction, and I mean to speak with the sheriff about it come morning, though I have given my word to hold the box till then, and a man's word is the only coin he truly owns. 3 times over Mercy Doyle read that line in the fading light through the round west window. Then she set the ledger down very carefully and went to the trunk. Wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, Inside it, she found a strong box, iron-banded, its lock long since rusted through, and when she worked the lid open with the flat of her axe, it came away with a groan of old hinges. Packed in straw gone to dust lay bars of raw silver bullion, unmarked, unstamped, 22 of them by her count, more wealth in one small chest than she had ever imagined holding in her 2 hands, along with a folded packet of papers tied with a ribbon that had once been blue. She sat down on the edge of that dusty desk in the last of the light and untied the ribbon and read. County Land Office deeds and a private ledger of accounts. The papers were, all bearing the signature, over and over, of a name that meant nothing to her when she first read it, and everything to her by the time she reached the bottom of the 3rd page. Ezra Voss, County Land Commissioner 9 years past, father, she would learn within the week, of the very Garrett Voss who now ran the Cutter's Creek Bank and had ridden out to offer her $200 for a played-out mill and 40 acres of thistle. A story took shape from those pages, told in the dry, careful language of deeds and ledgers, and it took Mercy Doyle the better part of that night to piece it together by lamplight. 9 years before, Ezra Voss, then Land Commissioner, had used his office to buy up water rights and creek bottom acreage all along Cutter's Creek at fraudulent low valuations, forging the signatures of tenant farmers he'd forced off land through manufactured back taxes, and had converted the stolen proceeds, a sum that, even by the conservative reckoning in his own hidden ledger, ran past $4,000 into raw silver bullion, meaning to hold it quietly until the scheme could be laundered clean through legitimate land sales once the scandal, if it ever surfaced, had time to cool. Somewhere safe and unlikely, he had needed to hide that silver while the ink dried on his fraud, somewhere no one would think to look, and he had chosen the one man in the county everyone knew to be too honest and too solitary to ask an inconvenient question, Abel Renner, alone in his windmill, keeping his own counsel. Reading between the ledger's careful lines, Abel Renner had understood by that same evening exactly what he had been asked to hold, and had written in his own hand that he meant to speak to the sheriff about it come morning. Sitting very still in that dusty little room with the papers in her lap, Mercy Doyle understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the spring night coming on outside the round window, that a man who meant to expose a corrupt land commissioner's fraud the very next morning, and who vanished from a locked tower that same night without a trace, had very likely not simply walked off into the flats on his own 2 feet. She thought of the scrap of paper nailed to the ground floor door frame in a shaking pencil hand, "Do not go above the 3rd floor," and wondered, for the first time, whether that warning had been left by a frightened sheriff trying to protect careless children from a haunted room, or by someone with a much more practical reason to keep the county from ever finding what she herself had just found. Garrett Voss's eyes going up to this tower, while his mouth talked smoothly of water rights, came back to her then, and she understood that the son had likely spent years wondering whether his father's hidden fortune still sat exactly where it had been left, sealed. Behind 3 iron spikes in a tower the whole county was too frightened to enter, and that $200 was, in that light, a very small price indeed for a man to pay to make certain no one else ever climbed those stairs and found what she had just found. Sleep did not come that night. She sat at that dusty desk with the ledger and the deeds and the silver spread before her in the lamplight, and she thought long and hard about what a girl with 80 cents to her name and no family and no standing in any court could reasonably do with proof that the town's most powerful banker's father had likely murdered a man to cover a fraud. She understood, the way her mother had taught her to understand hard arithmetic at a kitchen table years before, that the honest path and the safe path were not, in this particular case, the very same road. Come morning, she did not run to the sheriff's office, and she did not run to Garrett Voss either. She rewrapped the strongbox in its oilcloth and hid it, along with the ledger and the deeds, beneath a loose floorboard in the second-floor room where she slept, a floorboard she herself had pried up and reset a dozen times that winter, mending the tower, and knew better than any other soul alive. She went about her ordinary morning chores as if nothing at all had changed, because a girl who has just found proof of a murdered man's last honest evening does not have the luxury of acting rashly on a discovery no one yet knows she has made. 2 miles into Cutter's Creek she walked that afternoon on the pretense of trading mending for salt, and asked Odessa Prout, carefully, in the idle tone of a girl making conversation over a counter, whether the old woman remembered much of Ezra Voss, the land commissioner, from 9 years back. Something complicated crossed Odessa Prout's face. The same complicated thing Clay Aldis's face had done when Mercy asked about the boarded door, and the old woman said, in a voice pitched low enough that it would not carry past her own counter, that Ezra Voss had left the county rather suddenly not long after Abel Renner disappeared, gone east to live with a married sister. Some said, though others said he'd simply had enough of a county that had started whispering about him in the same breath as the missing miller. He died of a bad heart 3 years later without ever once setting foot back in Cutter's Creek, and his son Garrett had come into the bank not long after on money nobody in town had ever quite been able to account for. Home she walked the 2 miles, turning that last detail over and over in her mind. Money nobody in town had ever quite been able to account for, and understood that whatever silver Ezra Voss had hidden in that tower, some portion of a fortune built on stolen land, and very possibly a murdered man's silence, had very plainly ended up funding the very bank that now held the note on half the creek bottom around her own 40 acres. If you've stayed with us this far, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe. Because what Mercy Doyle chose to do next is the part of this story that turned an entire village on its head, and we don't want you to miss a minute of it. She could have taken the silver quietly and vanished the way she'd once dreamed of vanishing into some bigger town 2 counties over, and no one alive would ever have known the difference, because the only 2 men who had ever known that strongbox existed were 9 years dead and 9 years gone respectively, and a girl with 22 bars of raw silver bullion could disappear into a life no landlord would ever again threaten to end. She thought about it in the honest way a person thinks about a temptation before setting it down, sitting alone at that dusty desk with the round window going gray with dawn. A scrap of paper nailed to a door frame in a shaking pencil hand came back to her, though, and a careful, solitary miller who had written, on the last night of his life, that a man's word was the only coin he truly owned, and she understood that a silver fortune built on stolen tenant land and a murdered man's silence was not, in any accounting her mother would have recognized, actually hers to simply keep and vanish with, however. Legally, it might now sit in her possession by virtue of a courthouse deed nobody had thought to read closely. An early April morning, with the creek running high and green along its banks, found her walking the 2 miles into Cutter's Creek carrying the ledger, the deeds, and 2 bars of the silver wrapped in a flour sack. She walked past the bank without so much as slowing her step, straight into the office of Deputy Clay Aldis, and laid the whole of it out on his desk, telling him plainly from the beginning everything she had found in the miller's room. 3 times through Clay Aldis read Abel Renner's last ledger entry, the same way she had, and when he looked up at her his face had gone very still and very careful, the face of a young lawman suddenly holding a matter far larger than any he had handled in 3 years on the badge, and he said at last that this was a matter for the county prosecutor, and very possibly for a judge from outside Cutter's Creek entirely, given that half the men who might otherwise hear such a case owed the Voss Bank money one way or another. Right to worry he turned out to be, because word of what Mercy Doyle had carried into the deputy's office traveled through Cutter's Creek by that same evening, the way word travels through any small place with more empty evenings than secrets, and Garrett Voss rode out to the mill himself the very next morning, alone, without his good wool coat this time, in a hurry that showed plainly on him for the first time since Mercy had met him. Not $200 did he offer this time, but $500, cash, standing in her thistle-choked yard with his hat in his hands, that same afternoon, for the mill and 40 acres both. No questions, no papers to sign beyond a simple deed transfer. When Mercy Doyle asked him plainly whether the offer had anything at all to do with a strongbox his own father had once hidden in her miller's room, Garrett Voss's careful banker's face went the color of old ash, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "My father," he said finally, in a voice with none of its usual smooth confidence left in it, "was not the kind of man you seem to think he was." "I don't know what kind of man he was," Mercy Doyle told him, and this much at least was entirely true. "I know what a ledger says, and I know a man wrote his last honest thoughts down the same night he disappeared forever. And I know his own words say he meant to speak to the sheriff come morning about a box your father asked him to hide." Standing very still in that yard for a long moment, something in Garrett Voss's face shifted, not into anger exactly, but into a kind of exhausted resignation. The look of a man who has spent 9 years bracing for a reckoning he half hoped would never come and half knew always would. He said quietly that he had been 19 years old when his father came home from the county seat, one night looking like a man who had aged a decade in an evening, and that he had never asked his father directly what had happened to the Renner Mill's owner, because some part of him had never wanted the answer confirmed in words he could not later unhear, and that he had spent every year since building an honest bank on money he had never once let himself examine too closely, because examining it too closely would have meant admitting what kind of man his father truly was, and what kind of son that made him for living comfortably on the proceeds regardless. Not a confession exactly, Mercy Doyle would reflect later, and certainly not proof that would satisfy any court, but it was, she thought, the first entirely honest thing Garrett Voss had ever said to her, and she told him so plainly. She told him, too, that she meant to see the whole matter through the county prosecutor's office regardless of what it cost either of them, because a man had died with an honest word left unfinished on his lips, and she did not intend to let that word stay buried a second time simply because it was inconvenient to the son of the man who'd likely buried it the first time. That summer's investigation took the better part of several months, and it was neither so tidy nor so swift as any story told around a fire likes to pretend such. Things always are. The county prosecutor, a gray-haired man named Otis Farrow who owed the Voss Bank nothing at all, having banked instead in the county seat 40 miles distant, took Abel Renner's ledger and Ezra Voss's stolen deeds and built from them, over long patient weeks, a case that could never quite prove murder outright. No body had ever been found, and 9 years of weather had erased whatever tracks might once have told a plainer story. But the case proved beyond any reasonable counties doubt the systematic fraud by which Ezra Voss had stolen creek bottom land from a dozen tenant families through forged signatures and manufactured back taxes, land whose true value, restored to its rightful heirs by court order that autumn, ran to several $1,000s in all. Finding the people the silver had been stolen from, not proving what had happened to the silver itself, turned out to be the hardest weeks of that summer, because a family run off its land by manufactured back taxes 9 years before does not sit waiting patiently in the same spot to be found again. Otis Farrow's clerk spent the better part of June writing letters to county courthouses 2 and 3 states distant, chasing down names half remembered from old land office registers. Mercy Doyle, who had nothing better to offer the effort than her own 2 hands and a willingness to ride wherever a lead pointed, spent 3 separate weeks that summer on borrowed horses, following faint trails to played-out farms and rented rooms in towns she had never heard of before, sitting across kitchen tables from strangers and watching their faces change, one after another, when she told them why she had come. A widow named Adeline Marsh, run off 80 acres of good bottomland with a forged signature not even her own late husband would have recognized as his hand, was found at last keeping house for wages in a rail town 2 counties south. She wept without shame at her own kitchen table when Mercy told her the county meant to restore what had been taken, and asked, through her tears, only one question: whether the girl sitting across from her had truly climbed those stairs herself. And when Mercy said she had, Adeline Marsh took her hand across the table and held it a long while without saying anything further at all. A family named Cobb, 5 children and a father with a bad leg from a thrashing accident, was discovered on a rented quarter section 40 miles distant, living in conditions poor enough that Mercy Doyle rode home from that visit in a silence. Clay Aldous, who had accompanied her, did not try once to break. An old bachelor named Silas Ott, meanwhile, had simply given up on ever seeing justice for his stolen 40 acres and had to be persuaded, over 2 separate visits, that the offer was genuine and not some fresh trick being played on a man too tired to fight it a second time. Each of these visits cost Mercy Doyle something of herself, the way carrying a hard truth to a stranger's kitchen table always does, and each one also gave something back. A small stubborn conviction that grew steadier with every family found and every account finally set right, until by the time the county held its final hearing that October, she had come to understand, in a way no ledger could ever have taught her, exactly what $4 and a borrowed axe had actually purchased her that morning on the courthouse steps. 6 tenant families who had been quietly ruined 9 years before, some of them scattered to other counties entirely and traced down only through months of patient letter writing, received restitution from the sale of Ezra Voss's stolen silver, sold at last auction under county seal with Otis Farrow himself standing witness to every ounce weighed and every dollar counted. Garrett Voss, to his lasting credit and to the quiet surprise of a county that had half expected him to fight the whole matter tooth and nail, contested none of it, turned over the bank's own records without a single subpoena forcing his hand, and testified at the county hearing that he had long suspected, without ever proving to himself, that his father's fortune carried a debt on it he had never found the courage to settle honestly. By order of the county court, Mercy Doyle received a finder's award of $200 for the recovery of stolen county property and the restitution of 6 defrauded families, a sum Otis Farrow himself pressed upon her over her own quiet protest that she had only done what any honest person would have done. He told her, not unkindly, that an honest person who does the plain right thing when the easy wrong thing was sitting right there for the taking has more than earned whatever the law can properly offer her for it. 1 year almost to the day since Mercy Doyle had bid $4 for a windmill nobody else would touch. The last hearing closed that October, and Cutter's Creek had become a town that spoke her name in the street the way a town speaks the name of someone it has decided, collectively and without ever quite announcing the decision, to be proud of. Odessa Prout no longer sold her flawed cloth at half measure, but gave her the pick of the good bolts outright, saying only that a girl who'd done that much for 6 ruined families oughtn't have to pay full freight for anything in this town again, as long as Odessa Prout kept the counter. Clay Aldous, who had carried the whole uncomfortable matter to Otis Farrow on Mercy's word alone and staked his own young reputation on her honesty, took to touching his hat to her whenever their paths crossed on the road, and once, walking her back out to the mill after a long day's testimony at the county hearing, told her plainly that Cutter's Creek owed her a debt it could never entirely repay, and that he for one did not intend to let the town forget it. Garrett Voss, for his part, did something Mercy Doyle had not expected of him. He came out to the mill one last time that autumn, not with an offer to buy her out, but with a proposal to help her repair the old mill race and restore the grinding works at his own bank's cost, asking nothing in return but the standing to say, publicly, that the Voss name had helped make the Renner windmill whole again rather than help ruin it a second time. Mercy Doyle, who had learned a great deal that year about the difference between a debt owed and a debt a man is finally willing to pay, accepted the offer plainly and shook his hand across her own kitchen table. Grain the Renner windmill ground again by the following spring. For the first time in 10 years, its sails mended, its stones turning true, its miller a 19-year-old girl who had arrived in Cutter's Creek with 80 cents to her name and left, within that single turning year, the owner of the one working mill for 20 miles in any direction, and the finder's fee that had gone, every dollar of it, straight back into timber and millstones and good iron fittings rather than into any comfort for herself. On an evening in the 4th month of that second spring, Mercy Doyle climbed the tower stairs past the 2nd floor, past the 3rd, past the great turning gears now oiled and sound again, and stood once more in the little round room at the top, which she had swept clean and fitted with a proper glass pane for the window and a small writing desk of her own. On that desk beside her own ledger, for she kept the mill's accounts now in the same careful hand her mother had taught her at. A kitchen table 20 years before, she had laid out the two objects that mattered most to her in all the world. The brass folding rule Tobias Ray's had closed into her hand in a tool shed in Holly's Junction. The one thing anyone had ever given her on purpose rather than left behind by accident. Beside it, a small leather-bound ledger that had once belonged to Abel Renner, its last honest entry still legible in a small, unhurried hand. The one object in the world that had cost a solitary miller his life, and had, in the turning of a single year, restored 6 ruined families to their rightful land and given a homeless 18-year-old girl a roof, a trade, and a whole town's respect. Standing at that round window with the last light going gold over the creek below, she thought of her father teaching her to read a wheel's rim for its flaw, of her mother humming over an evening sewing, of Tobias Ray's telling her a tool remembers who holds it kindly, and of a careful, solitary man she had never once met writing, on the last night of his life, that a man's word was the only coin he truly owned. She found that she could hold all of them at once now, in the same steady hand, that had once counted $4 out of the hem of a coat onto a courthouse clerk's ledger table, without any of that weight pulling her under the way it once might have. Below her, she could hear the stones beginning to turn, and the low, good grinding sound of grain becoming flour, and she put both objects carefully back into the desk drawer and went down to see to the work. Mercy Doyle was 18 when she bid $4 on a windmill nobody else would touch, and she had slept behind a feed store the night before with 80 cents and a satchel to her name. It was, by any honest accounting she ever gave of it afterward, the best $4 she ever spent in her whole life. If this story stayed with you, if you sat down inside it, the way Mercy Doyle sat down at that dusty desk with a dead man's last honest words in her lap, take a moment now to subscribe and to share this story with someone who has ever been told that the one thing left to them wasn't worth having. Those are the people who most need to hear how a girl with $4 and a borrowed axe climbed a boarded stairway nobody else would climb, and found not a curse waiting for her at the top but an unfinished honest word, and carried it the rest of the way to daylight herself. Before you go, sit with this question a little while, the way the narrator has been sitting with it. What has someone tried to seal away from you, out of fear or shame or simple convenience, that you found the courage to open anyway? And what did you find on the other side of that door that turned out to be worth more than the fear ever was? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you're willing, what you found behind your own boarded door. We read every one.